Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Moshe. This is Moshe Norman out of Lakewood, New Jersey, and happy to be back. Looks like the summer is just about winding down. It's actually Labor Day, so I guess it wound down, and we are now starting rumbling. School year is rumbling. Everybody's back to work, getting fully back to work, and back on the weekly Zoom call so that we could learn and grow and learn about the process of psychotherapy. And hopefully this year, the plan is to expand beyond just the process of psychotherapy and also begin touching on psychopathology, on various modalities. In the 2.25 or 2.5 years that we started the show, we really focused predominantly on the process of psychotherapy, what's going on in the therapy room. And I hope now to be able to expand that a little bit and go beyond that. And for those who are still intrigued and haven't heard enough, you can go back to old episodes in our Google Drive and watch from the various experts that we've had on, some of the greats like Dr. Irv Yalom and Sue Johnson, Dick Schwartz, and Kathy Steele, and the wonderful contributors to this terrific field of psychotherapy. Now, tonight, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Avrum Weiss out of Maine, which I just discovered is one of the United States. But thank you for informing me of that one, because I knew there were 50, but I couldn't remember the 50th. So Maine it is. I think we're even in the same time zone, right?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much for joining and agreeing to come.
My pleasure. I was just interested in your list of previous guests. Kathy Steele is an old friend of mine. I didn't realize she'd been on your show.
If you would have known, right? If you only would have known. Yeah. So yeah, we had some other very, very acclaimed and important people who really graciously gave of their time to just educate and inform some of the mental health folks out there. We have a group of almost 1,200 people that this goes out to. So again, thanks for coming on. Avrum, tell me a little bit about who you are, where you're from, how did you get into this, and how did you end up focusing on husbands? That's a kind of interesting niche.
I was very fortunate early in my career. I had some extraordinary training in something that seems obvious, but listening. And we were doing qualitative research, and we would take transcripts of an interview with somebody and spend as a group, we might spend 2 or 3 hours analyzing a paragraph of text, really almost Talmudic in a sense, really deep dive into the content. And so I learned to listen in a particular way. And in my practice, I started working with a lot of men. And as I listened to them, it seemed clear to me, they kept talking over and over about all the things they were unhappy with in their relationships. And I would say kind of naively to them, have you talked to your wife about this? And they would look at me horrified, like I had just asked the world's stupidest question. Like, no, I haven't talked to her about it. I'm afraid to talk to her about it. That's why I'm here talking to you. And so we gradually started unpacking this idea of all the different ways in which they were afraid in their marriages, in their primary relationships. And it's made a tremendous difference, both for the men and their relationships.
Interesting. Can you give me, before we get right into that, what men's fears of women are or their wives? Can you tell us a little bit about some of your earlier training, where you're coming from, and go ahead.
Sure. So you and I were talking earlier. My early training is in experiential psychotherapy, which is really where the work on therapist use of self originated with Carl Whitaker and his colleagues in Atlanta. So I did my PhD at Georgia State University with that group, and have been in private practice primarily. I've worked in a variety of places. I've worked in prison. I've worked in residential treatment. I've worked in state hospitals. I always wanted to have a large exposure to a lot of different kinds of work with different people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that the diversification, even at one time, keeps the spark going.
Well, it's how people used to train, and it's unfortunate that we've lost it, because if you read most of the greats in the field, and I would imagine most of the people you've interviewed worked with severely mentally ill. I mean, Freud, Jung, Adler, all that group worked with very psychotic patients. And I think there's a great deal to be learned in that, and we've sort of abandoned it as a field. So my first job out of school, I took a job as a psychologist in a treatment program for schizophrenic patients because I really thought that was important. If nothing else, people sometimes can get a little psychotic in their work, and you don't want to be afraid of that. You don't want to
Right.
be unfamiliar with it and worry about how to handle it.
Mhm. Okay. So you started talking about listening and
Yeah.
listening to the stories of men and husbands. And I think eventually or ultimately identifying some pattern or some theme. What you've
Yes.
said so far is that the number one pattern is that whatever it was that they were struggling with, they weren't sharing.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit to that? What is it that they were
Sure.
struggling with, and why are they not sharing?
Well, I give you a very everyday example that I think a lot of people will relate to. So, hypothetical person, guy, he's at work, and his friends say to him, "Hey, we're all going to get together and go get a beer after work. Do you want to join us?" For a lot of men, the first thought that comes to their mind in that situation is, "Oh, I wonder if my wife will mind. I wonder if she'll be upset." Before they even have a chance to think whether or not they would like to go with their friends, to go and spend some time with their friends, they will often worry first whether that's going to be okay. But the sad thing about that is that often in those situations, it's absolutely fine with the woman. In fact, they wish he would go out more with friends. They wish he would have more of a life apart from her. But it's a self-created fear on the man's part largely. And I'm happy to talk about where the sort of origins of it are, but I think that gives you an everyday kind of situation for people to connect with what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, I mean, if we took the word wife
Yeah.
out for a moment, would it be fair to say, again, this is very stereotypical, but is it not true that stereotypically guys are less expressive? And if they have something like that, sort of roaming somewhere or coursing through their brain, they won't necessarily express that, whether it's to a wife or to somebody else. Question number one. Question number two, would you say that potentially men may be feeling protective, and so they're feeling that their first obligation is to their wife, to whom they kind of signed up for and feel responsible for? Is that not almost part of evolution, or somewhere in the makeup of men and women?
Two great questions, but they're big questions. So you may have to help me. You have to may repeat the second question after I answer the first.
Okay.
So we know pretty clearly that, so you asked, the first question had to do with, is it just with women? Is it just with their wife or their partner? Or is it in general that men are socialized to not express emotion? Yes, of course, men are socialized to not express emotion. And it's important to recognize here that that is learning. That's learned, not innate. The research on this matter is very clear that men are just as emotional in terms of that men experience emotions the same way women do, but are socialized to not express it. There's a marvelous book by a woman by the name of Judy Chu, who'd be a great guest for your show. She's an interesting woman because she's a psychologist and a congressperson in California. So I don't know what free time she has, but she's a very interesting woman. She wrote a book called When Boys Become Boys, and it's a book about the socialization of boys into gender roles. And she tells this story about a boy who is either in kindergarten or first grade. And at the end of the year, this teacher says to the kids, everybody gets to pick their favorite song that we learned during the year and lead the class in singing it. So this young boy gets up in front of the class and he starts to sing a lullaby. At which point all the boys in the front row start snickering and making fun of him. And the young boy says, "Oh, I was just kidding. That's not my song." And he starts to sing from the halls of Montezuma. So he understood immediately what the cost to him in being shamed and mocked for being himself, for saying what his favorite song was, which was identified by his peers as feminine. And so in the literature go ahead.
I mean, this to me feels like a very triggering and controversial discussion.
Yes, it
because obviously, I mean, there are obvious arguments to that point, which would be, well, where did the friends get that? Where did the, you may have a more feminine boy, and why are the friends under
Yeah.
the impression or notion that there's something feminine about it? And the answer may be because innately boys are different than girls and they don't express. So when you have one boy who does, he's strange. He's the odd man out.
What's interesting about that is that the study took place in a Quaker school with where there was a very strong effort in both the school and the home to not gender stereotype the kids. And so the parents and the school were both. So for example, the school had a rule, you can't play with guns. No, none of the kids were allowed to play with guns. But the kids, as soon as the boys, as soon as the teacher's back was turned, would immediately start turning Legos into guns. And so again, I think the literature is pretty clear that this is not innate, that this is socialized. And what Chu's book points, go ahead.
No, I don't understand. Isn't that evidence that it is innate? Why are the boys all creating guns if there was no precedent to it?
Well, I think what the data suggests is that it's through the culture, that all of the peer socialization is what forms and shapes these gender norms.
So does Judy make the argument that if boys and girls were left to their own faculties, they'd all be the same?
I don't think she
They'd be
answers
just as
that
men would be just
question.
as nurturing to their children as women would, and
Well, I can give you one piece of information about that, which is, again, the research is pretty clear that until about kindergarten or first grade, that boys' friendships with boys are as close and intimate as girls' friendships with girls are. And that after this change, after this sort of adaptation to these gender norms, boys relinquish a lot of their closeness with their friends, which is a tremendous loss for them. So I think that research suggests the answer to your question would be that they would be more alike than not.
And would she argue that boys are made with broader builds and stronger muscles, and that's also some kind of social development?
I don't know. I don't think she addresses that, and I don't
Okay.
have an answer.
I mean, to me, again, like I said, it may be controversial, but this just seems something very natural about boys being boyish and girls being girlish, if we can say, because just from the way that they're set up from nature.
Yeah, but Moshe, being boyish doesn't have to include the things that we in our culture include in masculinity. And unfortunately, there's a lot of really interesting work on what's called fragile masculinity. And the idea is that girls are born identified as female and don't really question their gender identity, whereas boys are taught that masculinity is not something that's innate, but something that has to be earned and then protected at all costs, which is what that little boy standing in front of the class was clearly experiencing. And the problem is that we don't have a very proactive idea about what masculinity is. It's mostly defined oppositionally. And so in our culture, masculinity often means not feminine. So then any sign of femininity is taken as a slight and undermining of one's masculinity. The problem is that some of the values that we assign to feminine are values that are really an important part of life. So things like tenderness, openness, warmth, intimacy, being close with somebody else, all of those things can be experienced by men as threatening because they can be seen by others as not masculine.
Okay, I think I understand the argument, but to me, I have a family of 8 children of my own, and I've observed and watched hundreds of children, and it seems to me quite far-fetched to argue that there isn't tremendously innate differences between boys and girls, males and females that manifest in some of the ways that she's arguing aren't the case.
I'm not arguing that there's not an innate difference. I don't disagree with you about that. I'm saying that the extent to which it is socialized is greater than we acknowledge.
Okay, I guess that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's bring. Okay, and the other question was about. You told me to remember the second one. It was about.
Thank you.
But I didn't remember it. I wrote it down. So
all right. That counts.
I guess good enough. About men being protective. I mean, you could make that same argument then.
Yes. So it's a great example. So a number of the fears that men have of women have to do with the fear of not living up to the role as a man that's expected to them, or that they imagine that their partner expects of them, and that's certainly the culture. And one of the roles that we expect men to fill is to protect and provide. And so again, what you see in heterosexual couples a lot is anytime the woman is upset, the man gets defensive. More than compassionate, often the man gets sort of entrenched, withdrawn, and that's because it feels like, the word I hear men use most often is criticized. And I think where they're coming from is feeling that if their wife is unhappy, they take that as an indictment, as a failing on their part, that they haven't done their job to, as you described, to protect.
So they feel inadequate, or like they failed
Their
wife in some way. And that's something I could certainly relate to.
But it creates a sort of, you can see the communication problems, because the woman is trying to express a desire for connection, and the man's feeling attacked and is withdrawing. She's pursuing, he's withdrawing.
Exactly. So let's get to that. Just again, I want to make that disclaimer that I do see this as evolutionary and part of nature, that men are bigger and stronger generally. I mean, I'm only 5'2", so we can't say that in my case, but generally men were created bigger and stronger. Women were created more vulnerable, and men pursue women, and so there is a innate nature for a man to want to protect. I mean, that would seem, and I also appreciate the notion that once that nature exists, there may be a social expectation that's added to it, and that I can understand.
Well, and just to give you some evidence for that, biology is a constant across the world, but masculine roles vary quite a bit from culture to culture. What we expect of men in different cultures varies. So you can see that there's both a cultural element as well as an innate element.
In some area, I don't assume that in any culture, the woman is expected to physically protect the man.
I don't think so.
Okay, so okay.
Yeah.
Now,
but there are many cultures in which intimacy between men are much more comfortable with open displays of physical affection than our culture.
Yeah, well, you can see that from some of the studies that they did in Europe, in let's say France, where they observed, I don't remember if this was a study or it was a video thing, but they observed men going out, for coffee or to the restaurant with their guy friends. And they watched what it looks like in Europe, in France, in England, and in the United States. And the amount of, in an hour or whatever it was, of physical contact between the two American men was, I think, once in the hour.
Right.
And between the Frenchies was like 400 times or something.
Exactly.
And England somewhere in between.
And remember what I said a little while ago about boys having very close and intimate relationship with other boys and losing that as they get older. And that's nothing changed biologically. That's culture there.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how that now plays in, as you started saying, into the relational patterns. Go ahead.
Sure. So the pattern that I think is familiar to most people who work with couples is sometimes called the pursuer-distancer pattern. And I think understanding it through this lens of men's fears gives us a whole different, not only understanding of the pattern, but a different way of working with it, even more importantly. So most therapists think about the man's end of that pattern as being sort of low EQ, not very emotionally fluent, emotionally withholding, defended. If the therapist might talk about it in terms of power, the man engaging in an attempt to hold on to power in the relationship. But what I think is largely not understood is the extent to which that withdrawal is driven by fear in men. So, for example, one of the fears I talk about in the book is the fear of emotion. So in most arguments in heterosexual couples, as women get more emotional, men get more insistent that the argument remain rational, and they'll do all they can to keep things sort of as unemotional as possible. That is often, I've lost your image. I see a different screen.
You should see me now.
There you go. Thank you. So the man will insist that he'll sort of insist to his wife that she remain calm and rational, and that is often, I think, misinterpreted by therapists as being about control. And I think what they don't understand is that because men are not as comfortable with their own emotional experience, what they're trying to control is not so much what their partner's feeling, but what they're feeling in response. They're trying to keep her calm to feel less themselves. It's the only way they know to not feel flooded is to try to control the source.
So if the wife becomes dysregulated or becomes upset, then that causes anxiety on the
triggers
husband's,
him.
triggers some of his anxiety, and because he is not allowed to feel that socially, he's not allowed to feel that, he becomes panicky and anxious and wants to now control the environment.
Except you can't see it because men are trained to appear to be stoic. So from the woman's perspective, she's getting upset and sees him getting increasingly cold and withdrawn. So what does she do? She gets more upset. What does he do? He gets more withdrawn. And that's so typical in couples arguments, that kind of pattern. And what happens is when you talk to the couple about the man being afraid, it softens the woman. May I read you a quote from so this is from a woman in a workshop. This was a workshop of men and women together. And she wrote this. It was an interesting format because we met for 2 days. And then 4 months later, we met for 2 more days. So they had a chance to go home and really try this in their relationships. And interestingly, it was the women who came back talking about the most change in their marriages more than the men. And this woman who in this workshop wrote, I understand that my husband has not been ignoring, dismissing, or hurting me out of a lack of respect, as I suspected, but that he's scared to hurt me, to mess up with me, to not be enough. I had honestly never imagined that he was scared and that I was so profoundly important to him that he was constantly terrified I would leave him. So when women understand that what's going on the other side is less aggressive or withdrawing and more based on fear, they soften and become more compassionate, which makes men less afraid and more open. And it can really, even that little understanding can really reverse that whole escalation that so happens so often. So one of the things that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that's happening that I never thought of is a lot of couples are saying to me, they're reading the book together. So they will read a chapter and then make a time to sit and talk. Then they read another chapter. And the men are basically saying to the women, yeah, like that. That's me. I don't know how to say it, but read this chapter and then you'll understand what I'm trying to show you.
The book you're referring to is Hidden in Plain Sight?
Yes. Hidden in Plain Sight. Yes.
That's the latest book that just came out. Correct. How long ago?
A little less than a year next month.
Okay, so Hidden in Plain Sight. That's the masterpiece we're talking about.
Yes.
And then there's the other books, Living and Loving.
Yeah.
Mutually, Change Happens. And Experiential Psychotherapy.
Right.
Okay. So now the thing that caught my attention before was number one, it's again from the way you said it, I'm not sure if this is what you intended or not, but it sounded like there's the onus is kind of on the woman to understand the husband.
I don't mean it that way. I'm saying it that way now to make it clear that this is not an idea that benefits only men, because I think it can be misunderstood as a topic that just of interest for men. What I'm trying to say is that it is of equal interest and benefit to women. If you look at Amazon and you put in, books for women, you're going to see a lot of books written for women about how to understand men. Because women will say to you largely that they find men opaque, that they are frustrated by not feeling like they know more about their partner. And so I think I want your listeners to understand that this is a book that can also help women understand men, not just a book for men to understand themselves.
And I wonder if the reason that happens is because women seem to be the ones who seek help more often. They seem to be the ones who are more attuned. Again, I guess in a sense, I'm challenging the notion. Perhaps women are more attuned naturally than men are, and it's not just learned behavior. And so if we were to put out an equal amount of books for women and for men, the women would, there'd be a whole lot more women purchasing books and trying to understand their husbands than husbands trying to understand their wives.
Well, it's an interesting idea. I like where you're going with it, except that kids in preschool years boys and girls seem to be about equally emotionally in tuned and emotionally expressive. So again, that points to at least some significant learn because the biology is the same.
I'm wondering if anybody has any comments or knowledge or questions on this. Please raise your hand by using the reactions tab on the bottom right of your screen. If you have any questions, this is a fascinating
I'd love to hear from you.
It's a fascinating discussion in its own right. I'm actually struggling to understand whether we're agreeing or disagreeing.
Well, I think we're both. I think you're adding an important dimension, which is that it's not just all learned. And I'm saying to you, I agree with you, but there's a big learned component. And actually, I think that what I'm saying is a somewhat more optimistic perspective, because what's learned, of course, can be relearned. And so if we were to believe, and I don't think you're saying this, that men are sort of innately emotionally constricted, that would be a harder row for us as therapists to work with them to be more open and involved in their marriages. But if you believe, as I'm saying, that the capacity is there in men as it is in women, then it's really reconnecting with a part of yourself that you've really just lost, not don't have.
Okay. Well, let's take a question. Shoshana, go ahead.
Hi.
Thanks for raising your hand. And thanks for joining. I don't know if you've been on here before.
Yeah, I have. Thank you so much for having me. The thought that's been going through my mind since Dr. Weiss started talking, I think, was the social conditioning aspect of, even let's say if a boy falls and hurts himself and we treat them like, boys don't cry. And if a little girl cries, like we're totally open to that. So we teach them from a very young age what we consider acceptable or not.
Yeah, that young age looks to be about 3 or 4 months, sadly. There's actually some really convincing evidence that parents unknowingly and unwittingly respond differentially to boys and girls around exactly those same kind of issues as young or 3 or 4 months. The example I always use is when my kids were little, they played soccer. And what I learned is when a kid falls down on the field, if he looks up and sees his mom, who's going, "Oh, are you okay?" then he starts crying. If he looks up and sees his dad who's going, "Come on, get up, get back on the field," then he or she gets up and gets, that we cue our kids as to what behavior we think is appropriate. And they follow, we're the sun and the moon to them. And so, of course, they follow.
Thank you.
Good point.
So could you tell me a little bit about the therapy process or the counseling process that goes on to, I guess, sort of convey, and what are some of the attempts and what are some of the challenges in conveying this message?
Well, one of the biggest pieces of learning for me is how differently it goes with men in therapy when you're just talking with men. So I started running men's groups about 12 years ago. And I distinctly remember the evening that I was getting ready to walk into the room for my first group with just men. And I thought, this is the worst mistake I've ever made as a professional. They're going to talk about work. They're going to talk about sports. They're going to circle around and nobody's going to do any work and it's going to be awful. Well, much to my surprise, I've learned that the groups I run for men, the men are far more emotionally open in a group with just other men than they typically are in mixed groups. And so what I've learned is that for many men, the first step, it's really sort of a bridge too far to jump right into being more open with their wives. And it often works better if they're in a group with other men and sort of practice emotional fluency with other men and learn about the skills involved and then move towards more emotional sharing with their wives. And
so is that deliberate? Do you deliberately do that, or is that part of the protocol that the men have to be part of male groups before?
It's become because I've learned from these men what is more effective and more helpful for them. And so in the book, I went to a lot of trouble to do a sort of almost a recipe for men who would like to get together with other men and get together and talk. There's a sort of step-by-step guideline for men about here's how to find other guys who might be interested. Here's how to start a group, kind of support group for other men.
Avrum, isn't it true that when men get together, typically they talk about how to fix things and how things work and science? And
well, that's what I
when-
expected.
Yeah.
But in a different context with a different expectation, what I learned is men are dying to talk to each other. That what's funny, it's one of those things where everybody says everybody's not like them.
Right.
Like every man will say to me, well, I'd like to be closer to other men, but I don't know any other men. I'm like, well, you know.
But okay, but you're also running a group, which is a
Yeah.
psychotherapeutic group. So
Absolutely.
you have men who are coming in with the expectation to talk feelings and emotions and not just
Absolutely.
about cars.
What I'm
and
saying is that in social settings, that many men are sitting there wishing
that
were
they can
more personal.
Yeah.
and
Oh, I
that
can
they could-
relate to that.
Yeah.
I can connect to that. And in fact, I think that was part of the loneliness of my childhood was wanting to talk about deeper things such as emotions and people and connection and relationships, and not really finding the place among guys to do that. But I
Not
didn't
really
know that there
finding
were
a
other.
place. And I think maybe if you think back, you might even recognize that there was some hesitancy and some awareness on your part that it might not be received well.
But yeah, that's probably why I withdrew.
So the only time in my life I have ever been arrested, I was 17 years old, and I had driven my first really close guy friend. I drove him home, and we're sitting in the car, and we just talking. And eventually I turned the car off because I'm burning gas. And so we're sort of slumping down in our seats, and the police came behind us and arrested us and took us to the jail. At the time, I didn't understand what happened, but years later, I look back and I think they didn't have a lens or a template to understand two young men sitting in a car talking to each other. So they assumed we were up to no good. And they brought us into the police station. I think if it had been two young women, they would not have arrested them.
I think they were arresting you because you turned off the car to not run gas when gas was 29 cents a gallon. Shame on you. You should have kept that air conditioner on.
It was 20. You remember that is how much it was. It was exactly that.
Yeah. Okay, so I know there's another person out there, another male out there who likes to talk about, who likes to have what we call DMCs, deep, meaningful conversations. And it wasn't only me as a teenager.
Absolutely.
Okay, but are we the norm? Are we the norm? Do most guys sort of crave or wish? Because they didn't seem to. They seem to be really happy talking about cars.
You know, I have a bias. It's a great question. And I have a bias sample problem because I'm a therapist. And so most of the men I talk to, the answer is definitely yes. But I don't know, I have a practice full of men who never in a million years thought they'd ever be in therapy and are now, strong advocates for therapy because of how much they've gotten. So I don't know if other men who haven't had that experience would or not. I don't know if they self-selected. I don't know, but it's a great question. I'd like to think that we are not outliers. I would like to think that most men, given the opportunity, would welcome it.
Okay. Well, I don't know how many men there are on tonight, but if somebody knows how or wants to create a poll, and we can take a poll from the 85 people. Well, actually, I don't know how many men there are, probably 20%. And that's
probably.
That probably also has a reason, right?
Yes.
I'd love to hear what people say. But maybe I'll put it on my LinkedIn account and see what.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's a bias sample. I think people who are drawn to listen to a show like yours
Oh,
probably.
but on LinkedIn, you'll get a little bit more.
Yeah. No, I'd love to hear what you find.
Sample size. Okay.
Yes. I think if the men can answer, here's my prediction. If they can answer privately, they'll say yes.
Okay.
So in the groups that I do with men, they hug at the end of groups and talk openly about loving each other. And these are, businessmen and the very traditional kind of guys. And again, not what I expected.
And
But-
that was spontaneous, or that's
Yes.
spontaneous?
Oh, no, that's spontaneous. There's another great book by Thomas Joyner, wrote a book called Lonely at the Top, which is about the process where men sort of forego closeness in pursuit of career, and then often end up sort of in midlife, typically sort of looking around and saying, well, I made a lot of money, but I don't know anybody. And feeling incredibly lonely. And of course, as we know, all the research now about loneliness in men and how physically dangerous
Mhm.
loneliness is.
Is there any hypothesis that's why life expectancy is shorter in men?
Yes, absolutely.
Is that right? Is that right?
Well, we know that
We know
loneliness.
that, yeah, we know that loneliness is a predictor for a shorter lifespan.
Yes,
And we know that
more than smoking cigarettes. So, your doctor, when you go for an annual physical, the doctor asks you, do you smoke cigarettes? Do you use drugs? How much do you drink?
But
Should be asking you.
They don't ask if you have social connection.
Right.
Mhm.
But actuarially, if they were just following the data, they would ask you, who's in your life?
Mhm.
When you're upset, who do you talk to?
Okay. So bring me back now. So right now we're in the stage of male to male support groups,
Yeah.
really engendering feelings talk.
Yes.
I imagine a lot of relief
Yes.
for these men who've been craving for something
Absolutely.
deeper,
Yes.
and finally can express it and find camaraderie with their guy friends. Now what happens next?
Well, what we want is for them to start doing that in their relationships with their kids and with their spouses. I'll tell you a lot of therapists complain a lot about Zoom and working online. But I'll tell you a story on the other side, a great thing that happened in a group that's very much about this. So we're doing a group, it's a men's group. And one of the guys is talking about, the content doesn't matter, but he's very upset about something. And I asked him if he's talked with this about his wife, and he had not. And it involved her. It was something that it was really important for him to talk. So I said, look, why don't you turn your camera off and mute and go talk to your wife and tell her what you're telling us, and then come back to group. And that you can't do when you're all sitting in a room together. So it went, and she was very, I don't know what the word, not relieved. She was deeply appreciative to hear this part of his inner life that he had not shared with her.
Mhm.
And that without the group's encouragement, it really hadn't occurred to him to talk with her about it.
Mhm.
So that's what we want the next step to be, is that you take those skills and that you use them with your kids and with your wife to be closer and more open with them.
Sometimes I wonder if sometimes I will express this to some of my male clients and say, I only wish that your wife was sitting here, was a fly on the wall,
Yes.
sitting here and listening to you express these feelings and emotions and what it would mean to her, and how it would affect your relationship if she were sitting here and paying attention.
And of course, the women are sitting with their therapists and saying, God, I wish he would say a little bit about what's going on inside of him. I'm dying to know,
Mhm.
what makes him tick. Yeah, it's sad that, they're living side by side. They're not that far apart,
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting. I often tell couples that you guys are looking for the exact same thing from
Exactly.
each other,
Yes.
for the
Yeah.
exact same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, but at the end of the day, there does seem to be a disconnect, and there does seem to be fear. You're describing, men being afraid of hurting. I mean, what's the fear? Is it hurting their wives, or afraid of the reaction of the reaction of the wife is going to make them feel criticized and as
Yeah.
a disappointment?
So let me go back developmentally to answer your question. Do you know the still face experiment, social psych experiment? Are you familiar with the still? So it's a classic social psych experiment, and they pair infants and mothers, and they do a split screen, and they're interacting with each other, and you can see that it's a conversation. Even in infants, there's no words, but the baby makes a cute face and the mom smiles. So they're trying out behaviors with each other, and they're clearly having a conversation. So in the experiment, the mom is asked to turn around, and then she turns back with a still face. not an angry face, not a critical face, not a disapproving face. The babies decompensate within 60 seconds.
Mhm.
They start crying, they desperately reaching out, they're trying to do something cute to get their mom's attention. Some of them even lost bodily control and lost control of their bladder and bowel just from having their mom be non-responsive for a minute. Okay, now, of course, fast forward, and interesting research says that in conflict in heterosexual couples, men are more physiologically distressed, and the distress lasts longer than it does in women, which would be the opposite of what we would stereotypically expect. So for men, it's recreating our early, there's no such thing as a perfectly present parent. There are always gaps in attachment, gaps in nurturing. And for men, having a partner who is the same gender as their mother recreates those early dynamics and that same sense of desperation at times. So the childhood expression of if mom ain't happy, nobody's happy becomes in adulthood, happy wife, happy life.
I see. And which is in turn why men often marry their mothers.
Marry their mothers. And another, yes, absolutely. And another example is because, men are, we give the impression that we have no needs, we don't need anyone, we don't depend on anybody. But when couples break up, who remarries faster? Men by far. Okay, so obviously there's an interdependency. It's not a one side, obviously, but it's an unacknowledged dependency on the part of men. And so it gets acted out rather than talked about, as all unacknowledged feelings do.
Okay, any questions or comments? You've used the reactions tab and raise your right hand or left. Okay. So this is a developmental, this is already something that's beginning early in life.
Yes, I
And
think
now
so.
we have the support group
Mhm.
in which men are learning that it's really okay to express their emotions, they're testing the waters, and they're getting lots of gratification from it. And
Yes.
we're hoping from there that they can, I mean, is it part of the process that we encourage them to now go home and speak this way with their wives?
Absolutely. And the word you used that I really liked just then was hope. I think that the experience of getting with other men and beginning to talk about their inner lives creates a lot of hope for men. I think that it gives them hope that they don't have to be as alone. I think a lot of men sort of settle into a place where they just think, this is it. This is as happy as I'm ever going to be. And we're talking more about marriages here, but I want to add children into the picture because I've worked with so many men who are essentially estranged from their children, who couldn't tell you their children's eye color, who couldn't tell you what their classes are in school. They're so focused on being the provider for the family. And there's and I'm not wanting this to sound critical, because what I think mostly is that it's terribly sad. Because I think those guys want to be close with their kids. I think they, as any human being would, and they've become so estranged. And then, of course, their wives are mad at them that they're not. And then it becomes a power struggle in the couple, which just makes it even more complicated and more difficult.
Yeah.
But I think the same things happen with this work with dads and their kids, is that they get a little less rigid and a little less scared and a little more open. And then, of course, their kids are, who doesn't want to spend time with your dad,
What is the session with a couple look like now?
At this point in the process that we're talking about, or
well, either way, I'm imagining that this is what the process looks like, but I'm sure it doesn't always. I'm sure there are times that you're seeing a couple without their husband being in one of these groups.
Sure. One of the things I want to start doing in workshops is I want to do like you remember the Newlywed Game? Did you ever watch the Newlywed Game? It's a game. It was a game show, and the one member of the couple would be asked to say what they thought her husband or wife would think about something, and of course they'd always get it wrong. And so part of what goes on in couples works is, and part of what couples have found valuable about reading the book is that there's just so much that they've never talked about. And so if you can develop a sort of atmosphere of curiosity and interest, then it's a fascinating process, to learn this place where you've been butting heads all this time. If you can sort of back up a little bit and listen a little more, and that make a place that's safe enough for your partner to talk about what's behind that for him or her, it can be very exciting.
But don't you find that the men are more limited? And again, this is against stereotypically, because sometimes it could be the opposite, the absolute opposite. But don't you find that in general, numbers wise, men do have a hard time expressing their emotions?
I think
And-
it's where it starts, but I'm happy to say it is not at all where it ends, because men are human like anyone else and want to be close and want to be connected. So one of the things I often say to men is when they're having a hard time talking about something, I will say to them, think of it as foreplay. And I will explain to them what the benefits, not just sex, but what the benefits are for them, that it's not just a demand from their wife that they be more open, which is often how they hear it, but here are the things that could change in your life that I think you want.
It's an enhancer. It enhances everything.
Yeah. One of the things which is meaningful for a lot of men that I tell men is that in my experience, men typically earn more when they have a good therapy experience. That's usually pretty motivating for most men.
But that's a social construct.
Sure.
But they have to
But
earn
it's
more.
also true.
Yeah.
The majority of people in my practice do earn more because they just get more integrated and they do a better job in most parts of their lives. And so and the goal of therapy is not to earn more, but it is something that frequently happens.
Okay. But what else can you tell me is discussed in the book, hidden in plain sight, that we haven't covered?
Well, the fear, so that I lay out 7 fears that I think exist. And of course they overlap and they're not exact, but the bottom line is the fear that relates back to the still face experiments, the fear of abandonment. I think that on some level, men understand that they are not very interpersonally skilled, that they don't have a lot of close people, that they're not very close to their kids, they don't have close friends, they're not close to their siblings, and realize that they rely on their wives for most of their interpersonal connection. And so I think that's what drives men's panic about conflict. And men are sort of notoriously conflict avoidant. I had a guy tell me once that he could tell, he was so tuned into whether his wife was upset with him, that when he walked in the front door, before he saw her, that he could feel in the air whether or not that's true is not so important as the fact that he really believed that he was so hyper vigilant about whether she disapproved of him in any way, that he felt like he could feel it in the air.
I want to take a minute to think about this for a second.
Please.
The stereotypical interpretation, I think, is that guys are more narcissistic than women, and that they need that approval, and they need the wife to support them. The mom's the homemaker, and the husband's the doer and the go-getter, and she's got to fuel that through acceptance and nurturing, etc.
Of course. Why are men more? Why do we see men in a way that they seem more narcissistic to us?
Wait. Why are narcissists narcissistic?
Well, and what I'm saying is part of the reason that explains what you're describing is insecure attachment. That these are men who are not well attached, and so they look narcissistic because they're terrified. And they're holding.
And so are narcissists, just on a much more severe level.
Yeah.
So I mean, what I'm hearing you say, I guess, the synopsis of what you're saying is that men are socially raised to become narcissists. Isn't that what you're saying?
I think that narcissism is a defense that men often adapt to deal with what we're talking about tonight, is the way
Which
I
is
would.
the fear of abandonment, the
Yeah,
fear
it's a
of being.
socially acceptable defense for the fears we're talking about. And it's a socially acceptable, and it's actually a pretty adaptive defense in terms of the world is pretty reinforcing of narcissistic defenses.
Mhm.
You know, you go far using narcissistic defenses.
So the antidote to this is really to create open dialogue and safety and open communication.
Yeah. And we have to, there's such, we have such mixed feelings as a culture about what we want to do about men. You know, we know that, I heard I guess he was an epidemiologist talking once, and they asked, he was someone who studied, you know, trauma and disease and everything around the world. They said, what's the most, is it Ebola? Is it AIDS? You know, what's the most dangerous thing in the world? He said, oh, that's not even close. Most dangerous thing in the world are males age 16 to 22 or 20, whatever it was, cause more death and destruction and harm than any disease or virus or any phenomenon in the world. And so it's an incredibly, it's a critically important, but we are very torn about, we're conflicted about whether or not to try to understand the problem or punish it. And there's a lot of loud voices who are upset at any attempt to sort of sympathetically understand men, as if we should just imprison them and punish them and criticize them for their behavior. And I feel very strongly that many of the social problems that vex us are not going to change until we do a much better job at understanding the internal lives of men.
So would you make an argument? I think probably anybody would at this point, you know, in time, that areas such as male schools, male classes should be spending a greater time doing more supportive or more process than just didactic and kind of bullying and manhandling the boys.
Yeah, it's, yes, absolutely, obviously. The problem is, what are we going to do with the whole culture? You know, I mean, this school that Judy Chu studied was doing that, and yet the kids still felt the same pressures. So, you know, they still live in the world is the problem. They still live in the world, that same world that made you hesitant to reach out to another kid to be friends. That same world. So they're talking now a lot, the phrase that's used a lot with men is about what they're calling deaths of despair. You know, the mortality rate for middle-aged men, most of the world lives longer and longer and longer, and middle-aged men are living less. The lifespan is going down. And it's because of these deaths of despair, primarily addiction and suicide. So it's real, it's tangible. It's not just, you know,
And the despair is this sense of loneliness.
I think that's a big part of it, but also, you know, there's a big piece of economic despair in there too. I mean, a lot of people, I grew up with the expectation that I would do better than my parents. I don't think my kids have that expectation. I think they would be thrilled to do as well as me and don't expect to do as economically. I mean,
Why is that? What are you attributing that to?
That's what the data says. The data says that class permeability is going down, that we used to be one of the leaders in the world. Class permeability meaning the measure of how easy it is to move from one social class to another. The United States used to be the leader in the world. We are now near the bottom. So for most people, the whole American dream doesn't seem so obtainable to them anymore. And that hope and that dream drives, you know, I don't know when your family came here, but, you know, my grandparents were immigrants, and that's what drove them, was that dream, and that they worked incredibly hard because they believed that that was possible. And I don't think people have that belief so much anymore.
Okay. Wow. So bring me back to the therapy room.
Sure.
Now we have the husband and the wife in the room.
Yeah.
What does it look like? What's the ebb and flow? What's the back and forth? What's your role as the facilitator? What are you looking to cultivate?
My role is to help create the space where the man can talk more and encourage the woman to be patient enough to talk less until the man starts talking more. So I have to earn the woman's trust as a man. I have to work to earn her trust. If you will give me a little slack, if you will be patient and wait, it will be worth your while. If you will let me work with you here, I think you'll see that I can help him to be more open and that your patience will be rewarded.
And what is she being patient about? Is it that he can't properly express?
Yeah.
And you have to kind of open him up.
That the more what she has to be patient about is that the more she pursues emotional connection, the more he withdraws. So it becomes, and it gets worse and worse and worse, not better and better and better.
And so who's breaking that pattern? Is it
either one can?
Is it she with him or is it you with him?
It can go any way. So as my mother would say, it takes two to tango. So the man can break the pattern by being more open. The woman can break the pattern by being more receptive. It can happen from either place, but I'm showing them how the pattern is going between them and that either one of them can get what they want by doing their part differently, that they're both blaming each other and saying, if he would only do this, if she would only do that. And what I say to them is either one of you can do your part differently, and it automatically changes everything between the two of you because it's an interdependent system. If you do your part differently, he can't help but do his part differently, and same way.
Won't there be limitations in more complex couples who each carry their own stuff? I mean,
sure.
Won't there be spouses who will sabotage the process? If you have a borderline spouse or something like that, they'll sabotage the process because they may need to be a victim on some level.
Yes, of course. But what I want to say to you, Moshe, is that I've been in this field a long time. And the longer I am, the more in a compassionate way, I see how wounded all of us are. And that the couples you're talking about, the complicated, problematic, they're not so different as I used to think they are. And that they're just like you and me. They want the same thing. They may be more blocked and have fewer skills, but that core longing is still there. And I often also more admire and respect what it is that brings people together.
I think your point is well taken, which is if there's one area that we're all the same, it's in the longing for connection. Yes. So as whatever label or complication may be present, it's almost inevitably in that I want to feel more connected.
Yeah.
And so if we can make,
and who couldn't say of their spouse, oh, I wish she was more this or less that, or he was this and more of that. That's not going to change. That's always going to be true, and you can divorce and remarry, and it's still going to be true.
Right. But if we can get connected, then we're best off.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Nate, how are you?
Good. I'm doing well. All right. So a quick question. Actually, I have two. We'll do one first. You mentioned before about the sort of the pattern, the dance between both couples and how they're victimizing each other, they're hurting each other. One of the things that I hear from a lot of my couples is, why should I go first? Right? Maybe he should go, right? Why me? And I think they both have legitimate reasons. They both feel victimized. They're both hurting. So why do I have to put my stuff on the side and get over my, let's say on the husband side, the inability to communicate and reach out to this person who is hurting my attachment. Right?
Can I respond to the first and then you ask
Sure.
the second?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
It's the same as another version of that I hear frequently is couples will say to me, why are you talking to me so much? Why don't you talk to her? Why are you picking on me? And the reframing is, it's not, attention from me is not a punishment. I'm helping you, and you're thinking of this as giving in. Why should I have to do this first? Well, it's like, you're both standing at a banquet table. You wouldn't complain about who gets to go first. You're so locked into being guarded and defended that you're not seeing that the table, the old Hasidic story about the difference between heaven and hell. So in heaven, everyone's sitting at a sumptuous banquet table. I'm sorry, I got it backwards. In hell, everyone's sitting at a sumptuous banquet table, all the food you could ever want, but the forks are 4 feet long and they're strapped to their forearms and nobody can eat. They're all starving to death with food on the table. In heaven, it's exactly the same setup, but you could probably guess the ending. They reach across the table.
Eating the other person.
And that's exactly what you're talking about. There's food, more food than they could ever eat. It's right there. You just have to trust that if I feed you, you'll feed me and we'll both be well fed. So you take a chance, you take a risk. So what if you went first? What if you tried it? I mean, you've been stuck like this for years or decades. What if you fed her? See how it went. What do you got to lose?
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate that. I think it's a great way of sort of reframing it, right?
Yeah.
This is about you.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question is very quickly, practically in the session, what steps do you use to help men open up more and feel more comfortable? Because denial is like denial and projecting is what I usually come up with. I usually hit that brick wall, right? I didn't have a hard childhood. Nothing ever bothered me really. I'm really okay. Especially in front of their wives. I feel like maybe when we do an off session, if it's just them, they open up a little bit more. But yeah, how do you practically get them to?
Practically, I would probably meet with him alone. In that situation that you're describing, I would suggest that he and I meet alone to get to know each other. But to be very careful in that situation, to not in any way imply, let me meet with you because you're the more screwed up one, which is what he's thinking, I'm thinking.
Right.
So, and I think even 1 or 2 meetings with him can be really enough to change that dynamic. For me personally, I think what makes it work with men is that most of the time when men say things like that, I smile because I recognize in myself every single resistance and defense that they're throwing up. I've been there. And so I have a sort of compassionate, good humor about it. I'm not rigid or defensive or combative with them. I really am kind of amused. It's like, oh yeah, I remember when I used to think that. And I think it's helpful to kind of soften things.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Thanks for your question.
Okay, let's take a question from Sippy.
Hi, thank you so much. This is very interesting. So based on the conversation tonight, very often we hear that men like to be independent and they don't like to accept help. How does that fit into what we spoke about tonight? And is it accurate?
Well, it certainly is accurate. And it's exactly because of what we've been talking about, because of what we talked about with fragile masculinity, that men are taught that they should be independent to the point of self-reliant. And that to accept help or need help is to be feminine and therefore not masculine. And of course, it creates an enormous amount of pressure in men because of course they want help and they want to be, they don't want to have to always do it all alone. And so it leaves them in a real bind.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, back to Nate's point, how would you get a man to acknowledge that he really wants help and that he can't do it on his own without a map or, asking the gas station attendant?
I think the back door is how overwhelmed and how burdened they feel.
So you need motivation.
Yeah, I think that the way you can reach men to talk about that is to help them see how burdened and overwhelmed they feel and resentful. Because the problem is, of course, that then when they're doing it all alone, they're resentful. And who wouldn't be? So I think that's the way to get in there. I think that's the access point.
Wow. Okay. Shoshana.
Sorry for asking another question. I think that after listening to everything we talked about today, quite often in my couples, I definitely find a disparity in the EQ between the males and the females. I know there's going to be some point where we cannot our goal is not to convert anyone to be the other person, but how can we bridge the EQ? Is it something you can actually teach someone to have a higher EQ? And is there a process to follow?
Well, I think yes, thank God it's something you can teach, because I don't know what the world would be if it wasn't. And I think you're indirectly hitting on a really important point, and I appreciate you bringing it up. Men anticipate that therapy will not be a friendly place for them, particularly couples therapy. Most often the therapist is woman, and men, when approached about couples therapy, will often say, I'm just going to be ganged up on. The therapist is going to take my wife's point of view and tell me I'm wrong. Okay, so there's a big push in our field now for cultural competency. To renew your license, you have to get training in cultural competency, right? So I think understanding the psychology of men is a cultural competence that all therapists should be required to have training in. Since half the people in the world are men, some organization asked me to do a workshop, and I sent in my proposal, and they said, we're rejecting it because it's not sufficiently tuned into, and I don't even know the jargon, but it's not dealing with underrepresented populations. And I wrote back and I said, yes, it is. In our field, men are underrepresented, both in the practitioners and the patients. And so, yeah, you should sponsor this workshop because it's a cultural competency we all need to have.
But what about the process of getting them there?
Well, I guess I'm saying that it begins with therapists being familiar with some of the psychology of men. And then I think just as if you were working with an African-American patient and had done your homework and had done some training in cultural competency, you would be able better equipped to help them to explore their internal life. I would say the same thing of a man. So I don't think that men have to see male therapists. I think that's nonsense. But I do think that therapists who work with men should know more about the internal lives of men.
I guess it's something, I mean, as a female, I guess I've been putting together over time, right? And I think one of the things that actually helps, and I think, it's like you said, a lot of men feel like they're in the hot seat quite often, especially if they are a big contributor to the issues at hand. But actually, I find that creating that therapeutic alliance with the male in the relationship is critical.
Yes.
Right. Like if he feels safe with me, and sometimes like you said, there's a method to this madness. Like
exactly. And there's something in it for him, and letting him know that. So that what the men anticipate is that not only that you won't understand them, but that the values of therapy will align with their wife's values and be critical of his. And so he needs to know that there's room in the therapy for him and his values, and that it won't just be proselytizing, trying to convert him to what his wife's been asking of him all along. Whitaker, who I mentioned earlier before we got on, the family therapist Carl Whitaker, said, when you work with families, first thing you have to do is establish an alliance with the dad, because if you don't, the work's over.
Right. And
that's the starting place.
And also I think very critical is when in establishing goals when they first come to therapy is hearing both of them. What is it that you're wanting out of this? Because quite often it's the same thing. So that helps, right? The communication, I'm sure, is like, a big people. But and then because they have a voice, now we've paid attention to what it is that they want, they feel like they count.
Yeah. And again, I am increasingly comfortable and like meeting together with the couple first and then with each of them individually.
Exactly.
And I think especially for men, that makes a world of difference.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Wow. That was amazing. Okay, well, it's 10 after 10 here in New York, East Coast time. And we're going to have to wrap things up. If anybody has any last questions, you can certainly shoot it at the chat or raise your hand. But Avrum, I really want to thank you for this.
My
I'm
pleasure.
so glad I happened across you on LinkedIn and we met up. And
Me too.
this is really, really insightful and important information.
Thank
I think
you.
to me, it just feels like, it's hard to explain, but it feels like the defense level in the room, is reduced in this way.
Yes. Well said.
The husband and wife could really look at each other for people who are craving connection, struggling to figure out how to make it happen,
Yes.
they can engage in how they can make it happen
And I
rather
think,
than
I'm sorry.
just engaging in the power struggle itself.
Yeah. And I think men need our help to articulate that. And I think that's where the book can be helpful, because it helps the woman to understand what he's having trouble articulating, which then makes more room for him to say more about himself.
Somebody asked what your contact information is. Can we get that?
My
It's all
website.
over. It's all over Google, by the way. Shouldn't be too hard.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. My website is Avrum Weiss, AVRUM Weiss, PhD.com. You will find a mailing list there. And if you sign up for the mailing list, you get a free copy of an ebook. And then you'll get copies. I write for Psychology Today regularly and some other, and usually about relationships, about men and couples.
Okay. Do you do any consultation or supervision or anything like that?
Yeah, I do online supervision groups, and right now I'm scheduling workshops to talk about this topic. So if you're a member of a professional organization that brings in speakers for your conference, on that website, you will find my contact information. I'd love to talk with you. I'm a bit of an evangelist about this stuff. And so I welcome opportunities to talk to people about it.
Okay, I think I have some ideas that I can come up with, and
Great.
let's be in touch afterwards.
I will follow up with you.
We are going to wrap up. Thank you very much for your time and
My
sharing this so
pleasure.
graciously, and the calm and collected tone and demeanor that you present with. I'm going to end the call, and if anybody wants to stay on, my traditional weekly, if anybody wants to stay on just to say hello and introduce yourselves and our camera shy, now's your time. So good night, and so long, and we'll see you next week.